Hi, this is Harold Pollack. I've just been noticing on my Twitter feed that that a bunch of people have been asking some pretty basic questions about screening tests and sort of what does a positive test mean for COVID or for a prenatal genetic test, something like that. And I thought it would be, worthwhile to just take a moment to talk about some of the basics of this thing. And we often ask, how accurate is a screening test? And if you really think about it, the word accurate has many meanings. We might just mean, how often is this test correct? And that's sometimes really valuable. But if you think about it, suppose we have a really rare condition. Here's a test. Somebody says, do I have this really rare condition? I just say, no, you don't have it. I have anxious relatives. They call me up. I read this thing in the paper. Do I have, thumb falling off syndrome? And I'm just like, no, you don't have it. And if that condition is, 1 in every 10,000, then my just no, you don't have a test is actually accurate 9,999 times out of 10,000. That's pretty darn good. That's 99.99%. Now, what we might mean by accurate is also, if I actually had the condition, how often would a test actually say that I have it? And that's called sensitivity. So, if I actually am living with HIV, how likely is it if I take an HIV test that it comes out, it's HIV positive? And on the flip side, if I don't have the condition, I take the test, how often does that test say that I don't have the condition? That's called specificity. And there's some trade-off in the way that tests are designed between sensitivity and specificity. For example, you might be looking for a particular protein in somebody's blood, and if it's over 100 parts per million, you say it's a positive test. And if it's below that, you say it's a negative test. And there's some trade-off. Do I set that cutoff at 100? Do I set that trade-off at 50? And so on. And sensitivity and specificity tend to be kind of properties of the way a test is designed. If I employed the same test in lots of different populations, the sensitivity and specificity would be basically the same across all the different populations. And it kind of depends on the biological properties of that test. Now, we might mean something slightly different, which is if the test is positive, not what's my actual condition, but just I look up, I took a home pregnancy test, there's a little plus there. How confident should I be, that I actually have the condition? And that's called positive predictive value. So if the test is positive, how likely is it that I have the condition? That's PPV. Or if the test is negative, how confident can I be that I don't have the condition? That's called negative predictive value. Now each of these terms, is important and can convey something about accuracy, in each of these cases. Now, I should say that all of these things we can actually talk about. I could jam at the blackboard and start talking about conditional probabilities and Bayes' rule. But actually, as you'll see, I think a 3x3 table is going to cover it pretty well. So, just to hammer it home again, sensitivity, specificity, positive predictive value, negative predictive value. There's some synonyms that I won't use that people sometimes use, like recall and precision. Recall is sometimes used for sensitivity, and precision for positive predictive value. So let's say you genuinely are pregnant or you genuinely have COVID and you take a home test. How likely is that test to come out positive? That's the sensitivity or recall. You're not pregnant or you don't have COVID and you take that same test. How likely is the test to come out negative? That's the specificity. Sensitivity and specificity, as I said, are kind of technical properties of a test. Flip side, you take that test, it comes out positive. How likely is it that you actually are pregnant? That's the PPV, or the precision. Or you take that home pregnancy or COVID test, it comes out negative. How confident can you be in that? Negative predictive value. And now the PPV and the NPV, they actually are functions of the sensitivity and specificity, but they also reflect the underlying risk within the population that's being tested. If I take a test for smallpox right now and it comes out positive, or for bubonic plague, I'm not worried. I don't have it. The positive predictive value is basically 0 in that case, because it's not present in the population. When a condition is very rare, many or most of the positive tests are actually false positives. When a condition is very common, many of the negative tests are actually false negatives. And as I said, we could write down the equations for all this stuff, but just a table of numbers kind of gets us there for a binary test very well. So you hear something, let's suppose we have something called Pollux syndrome. We have a population of 1 million people, and we have a basic test that's looking for Pollux syndrome. And let's suppose that 1% of the population actually has Pollux syndrome. And we've got a test that's 98% sensitive and 99% specific. So there's 10,000 people who actually have the condition. 98% of those people are going to test positive. That's 9,800. 200 of them are going to test negative. They're going to be false negatives. 99% of the population, that's the remaining 990,000, they don't have the condition. 99% of those people are going to test negative. So as I'm sure you figured out in your head, that's 980,100 can test negative, and 1% of that population, 9,900, are going to be false positives. So now let's ask, if I get a positive test, how worried am I that I actually have Pollux syndrome? The answer is, it's the fraction of 9,800 is a fraction of all the people who test positive. I know if I test positive, I'm in this column, but I don't know if I'm here. Whoops, I don't know if I'm here or I'm here. So it's 9,800 divided by the sum of these two. So, and it turns out in this case, it's about 49.7%. So a positive result basically says I have about a 50% chance, a little bit less than a 50% chance that I have it. How likely am I if I get a negative test that I've had it? Well, there's only 200 false negatives. So I'm incredibly confident if I get a negative that I'm actually in this group. And it turns out it's 980,100 divided by 980,300, which is like 99.98%. Okay. Now let's suppose that I have a slightly different test that's actually more sensitive, but it's a little bit less specific. It just pulls the trigger a little bit more quickly if it sees any evidence of Pollux syndrome in the blood sample that it took. And let's just do exactly the same calculations. So among the people who actually have Pollux syndrome, there's only 100 false negatives. That's good. So that, half the number of false negatives, in this test. But let's think about the people who don't have the condition. So now the specificity is now 98% instead of 99%. So actually we're generating 2% of everyone who doesn't have it, which is 19,800, are actually going to be false positives. So the PPV actually takes a big hit. It drops because now I know that I'm in this column, but 9,900 is only about a third of what's in this column. So the PPV is actually 34.5%. The NPV, by the way, is completely, is 99.99%. It's incredibly good in that dimension, but the PPV, we've taken a big hit. Now let's think, by the way, about what would happen if we did exactly the same tests, but we had something called Schmollick syndrome that was just really common in the population. Let's say it's 50-50 in this, half the people have it and half the people don't have it. And just ignore this is called a typo because proofreading is for the little people. Whoops. So actually, it's just that I advanced the slide inadvertently. So let's think about this now. So again, and we're looking at this thing where we've got a test, that is 98% sensitive and is 99% specific. So among the half of the people who have the syndrome, about 10,000 of them are going to be testing negative now. And in the remaining 490,000 are going to test positive. Among those who don't have the thing, 5,000 are going to be false positives, and 495,000 are going to be testing negative. So what's the PPV here now? Notice now the PPV is incredibly high. It's 490,000 divided by 495,000. So the PPV is basically 98.99%. So if you test positive for this thing, you've got it, with almost 99% probability. Now let's look at the NPV, by the way. It's actually gone down quite a bit because now you've got 10,000 people who are false negatives. So, so the NPV now, it's exactly the same biological test, but the population is different. Now, we might be really concerned about the NPV issue in a way that we weren't before. 2% of the people who test negative actually have this thing. And so you can see that exactly the same test, but looking for a more common condition, the PPV just rocks it. It's much, much higher, but the NPV is much lower. And so, so it's both the properties of the test and the underlying prevalence of the condition that really influence what I think when I get a positive test. If COVID is really rampant in my community and I get a positive COVID test, I'm thinking, wow, I'm much more likely to have this thing than if COVID is sort of incredibly rare in my community and I get a positive test and there's a realistic chance of, it's not a perfectly specific test. So that's just, some basic ways that we can think about this thing. And now if you say, which test is better, the basic test or the more sensitive test? You're right, both. It really depends on a couple of different things. Pardon me, I stuck an extra slide in there for some reason, because again, proofreading is for the little people and cutting and pasting and not checking is, that's someone of my importance can do that. First of all, you say, what is the clinical value of early identification for a condition? If it's super valuable to get early identification, you want a really sensitive test. If there's something you can do, and maybe it may be that what's valuable is it just gives people reassurance, and that's okay. But you want to know, what's the value of some early information? What's the cost of a false positive compared to a false negative? That's important to think about. Suppose there's a lot of stigma or social harm connected with a positive test. So, suppose that I'm doing a screening and assessment where I'm looking for parents who are abusing their kids. If I have a really sensitive but low PPV screening test, wow, that's going to cause a tremendous amount of social harm. I'm going to identify a ton of people and say, you're a potential child abuser when they're just not. And that's very different from, I have a very sensitive but low PPV screening test, say looking for diabetes, where, it's, I would scare a lot of people who turn out not to have diabetes, but, eventually we'll figure that out. And there's no sort of long-term harm to that person, except they may have to go to the diabetes clinic and waste some time, figuring that out. One of the real questions that we often ask is there some kind of a better, maybe more costly or risky or intrusive follow-up that we would do when we got a positive test? So for example, with pregnant women, there are a lot of conditions in the developing fetus where you can do a blood test that's relatively cheap, that's not dangerous or intrusive. And if we see a lot of proteins in mom's blood that say, hey, there's a risk here that the developing fetus has an issue, then maybe we do a follow-up, which could be amniocentesis that, we don't want to do for every 28-year-old pregnant patient, but we would do for, pregnant patient when we had this risk. And so very often, if say we had, we were assessing parents for malparenting, we had a very confidential process that was the lead into something that was a much more careful assessment than that sensitive but low PPV screening test looking for, serious parenting issues might be more reasonable. And so very often screening tests that have low PPV are kind of the front end of something, where you have the $1 test that says, hey, we're going to find the group of people that we're going to do the $1,000 test on if we have a reason to be really concerned. And no one test is best. It really depends on what are you going to do with that information. What is the cost of a false positive versus a false negative? What is the prevalence in the population of the thing that you're looking for? And that's really about it. So I'm gonna stop here, and that's it.